Welcome to Aquaponics Academy, a bright agrotech podcast designed to help you overcome common aquaponic issues, learn new growing techniques, and help you be as successful as you can be as an aquaponic practitioner. Whether you're just getting started or you've been growing aquaponically for decades, this podcast is for anyone wanting to design the best performing system possible. Join aquaponics expert Dr. Nate Story, the creator of Zip Grow Towers, as he breaks down complex topics into easy to understand information. And now, here's Dr. Nate Story.
Hey, this is Dr. Nate Story from Bright Agrotech, and this is Aquaponics Academy episode number 16. Today, we are going to talk about 3 macronutrients, 1 primary macronutrient and 2 secondary macronutrients. So we're going to be talking about potassium, that's our primary, calcium, and magnesium, both of which are secondary macronutrients. So we're going to be talking about these 3 nutrients because these are the most commonly deficient in systems, in aquaponic systems where you're supplementing iron. So I'm really excited to dig into this subject matter today, and I hope that you enjoy it as much as I enjoy talking about it. So let's get started. Potassium. So everyone is fairly familiar with potassium. It's commonly deficient. There are commonly issues with potassium in aquaponic systems because fish food simply does not have enough potassium in it to meet the system's needs. So the reality is that calcium is something that needs to be commonly supplemented. Same thing with magnesium. So magnesium is also commonly deficient in aquaponic systems. It's not always delivered in enough quantities for your plants to stay really happy. And the reality is that calcium is occasionally deficient as well, depending on the crop you're growing and whether or not it's a nutrient hog. So it's really good to understand these things and kind of how they enter your system, how they play with each other, and how they leave your system. Once you understand that, you'll be able to recognize deficiencies and treat them much, much more easily, and you're going to see a big boost in your production from your aquaponic system. So potassium, it's one of the primary plant nutrients. It is such an important plant nutrient. It does so many different things inside of plants. It impacts everything from kind of cellular metabolism. They use little potassium ions to inflate and deflate cells. They use potassium for all sorts of plant defense triggering mechanisms and signaling within the plant. Potassium is really important. And it's also really important in seed development. So when it comes to developing fruits and seeds, potassium plays a major role. And it also plays a big role in root development. So having a really strong, healthy root system depends on having enough potassium in your system. So a lot of the time when people see these kind of straggly little plants or these plants with poorly developed root systems, they may not be showing a potassium deficiency per se, but oftentimes they are potassium deficient because they just don't have enough potassium for their root systems and a lot of the other developments, fruit, seed, roots, signaling mechanisms to develop properly. So it's very important. I hope that is clear. It is very, very important to plants, but it's also commonly deficient in aquaponic systems. So deficiencies of potassium, calcium, and magnesium kind of tend to look the same. So I'm not going to dig into it too much this go around, but I will tell you that chlorosis is very common, and with really severe cases, necrosis. So the plant tissues start to turn kind of a pale yellow, and eventually you end up with some death. So some death on the plant leaves. Now, I'm not going to dig too far into what these different deficiencies look like because they can resemble each other, and the easiest way to diagnose deficiencies is with a key. Now, there are a lot of free keys online. If you go to Google and you just Google deficiency keys for plants, you're going to find all sorts of great stuff there, and a lot of it is free. If you are interested in an aquaponic system specific deficiency key, one that walks you through the specifics of diagnosing iron, calcium, magnesium, and potassium, in addition to that, nitrogen in aquaponic systems, then check out our website. We have a 99-cent key that's pretty nicely illustrated that helps walk you through the differences between these deficiencies. But, deficiencies tend to kind of look similar in some regards, so I'm not going to dig too far into it and confuse you guys, but definitely check out the key on our site and definitely definitely check out some of the other keys out there. They will help you differentiate between potassium deficiencies and deficiencies in some of these other nutrients. So potassium is super important for our system health. So how do we supplement it? Well, if you follow our other stuff, you know that we recommend potassium hydroxide. There are other folks that recommend potassium carbonates. For home and hobby growers that don't really care about production too much, yeah, you can use carbonates. Or if you run a system that has a low pH, consistently low pH, you can run carbonates. We don't recommend it because most people have hard water or relatively hard water, and you already have carbonates in your solution, so you don't want to go adding more. Instead, we recommend hydroxide, so potassium hydroxide. KOH, it's a very basic substance, but it adds potassium to your system as it raises pH. So if you run a low pH, we use hydroxides to raise pH. Now, if your system is pH neutral, you've got a few other options, including potassium sulfate, which is something that we use. It's got a rating like 0.050. It is strong stuff, but it's great for systems where your pH is neutral and you don't really want your pH to go up more, or a basic pH, right? Another option is, of course, kelp meal concentrate, not kelp meal. You're just going to be adding a lot of solids to your system if you use kelp meal, but kelp meal concentrate. And don't go buy in the liquid stuff. That stuff is a waste of money. You're paying to ship water. What you want to buy is the kelp meal concentrate powder, and you can get it at Kelp for Less. You can get it at a few other online vendors, and it's great stuff. It'll work really, really well for you, and it's going to be a very effective potassium and micronutrient supplement for your system. So save your money and do your system some good and use kelp meal concentrate. So those are your three options, really: potassium hydroxide, potassium sulfate, and kelp meal concentrate. And each of them has their place. Potassium hydroxide if you're trying to raise pH at the same time as supplementing. Potassium sulfate if you're just trying to supplement potassium and you're looking for really concentrated forms. And kelp meal concentrate if you are kind of just doing regular additions and you just want to keep your potassium levels high. And those three additions, in between the three of them, you can't go wrong. Now there are other options, including foliar sprays. This is like half of a teaspoon per gallon to 1 teaspoon per gallon of potassium chloride. Okay, so this is a salt, which means you want to add very small amounts, and you want to spray it on your plant leaves, foliar applications, preferably in the evening, and you'll get very fast response. So if you have a potassium deficiency, and that goes for, magnesium, it goes for calcium, it goes for iron, foliar applications are really great ways to supplement and see fast results. So that's kind of a different animal. Ideally, in the perfect world, you never have to do that. You can rely on supplements, regular supplements of things like kelp meal concentrate to keep your potassium levels high. So that's how we add it. It's very useful, and I'm going to talk about kind of how potassium interacts with calcium and magnesium a little bit later. But in the meantime, let's move on to calcium. So calcium, let me back up. Potassium is typically just available as an ion, right? So you've got a little potassium ion. It's got a positive charge. It is floating around in solution, and yeah, great stuff, right? Calcium, similarly, is available as an ion, a positively charged ion. It's floating around your solution. Calcium typically has 2 charges, so it's a little bit more, charged. But yeah, it's available as an ion in solution. It's soluble, and plants need it. Now, the weird thing about calcium is that calcium is kind of a passive uptake. So plants will actively take up magnesium, they will actively take up potassium, but calcium, for some reason, kind of just flows into the plant as the plant takes up water. So this is really interesting because if you have high humidity or really high CO2 and not enough calcium in your solution, sometimes you see calcium deficiencies because the plant just isn't taking up enough water to suck up the calcium that it needs. So this is kind of a cool thing to know. It's pretty rare, but it does happen, and it really happens primarily in highly enclosed, high-density systems where humidity is high and there's CO2 supplementation. So you can usually cure it by dropping your humidity and turning on some fans, and that will almost always fix that particular problem. But you see calcium deficiencies for lots of other reasons as well. Typically, it's not the plant can't move calcium around very easily within the plant. It's mostly used as a building material for cell walls. It's used for some signaling and some of the interesting little molecules that the plant builds to perform certain tasks. Calcium is a key part of those. So calcium is taken up by the plant and is stored by the plant. It's used for a lot of different things, but the interesting thing about it is most of its uses, the way it's used, make it not really a transportable ion inside of the plant. So once it's incorporated into the cell wall, the plant can't really just tear its cell walls apart and move the calcium around. No, it's stuck with it. So what this means is that when you see deficiencies in calcium, it often begins to develop on the new growth with many plants. So you'll see necrosis, dead tissue on a lot of the new growth, although that's not always true. I've seen, in slow growing plants or in plants that are not growing very quickly, you sometimes see calcium deficiencies on old leaves, but if it's death on new growth, it's almost always indicative of calcium deficiency. Now, if it's death on old growth, it could be sometimes calcium, could be magnesium, could be potassium, could be a number of things. So it gets a lot more complicated then. But the deficiencies for calcium are typically pretty darn straightforward. So again, if you need help diagnosing deficiencies, check out our key. It will definitely be helpful in that process. Calcium is sometimes deficient. A lot of the hard water that people have is calcium carbonate, or they'll add calcium carbonate to their system for whatever reason. And so it's a little less common to see calcium deficiencies in systems. If you do see calcium deficiencies in aquaponic systems, it's oftentimes tied to something like magnesium, right? Because they have the potential to kind of compete and impact the ability of the plant to take up the other nutrient if they're available in excess. So if there's too much calcium in the solution, it can impact magnesium uptake. Similarly, if there's too much magnesium, it can impact calcium uptake. So these are all kind of things to be thinking about and things to understand. When it comes to supplementing calcium, it's super important, not just for plants, but for microorganisms. It's super important for your fish to have enough calcium. Calcium is a big deal. And there are a lot of ways to supplement calcium, including chelated products, just like chelated iron. You can get chelated calcium. It's quite effective. Calcium chlorides for foliar sprays work quite well. And then, of course, calcium carbonates. So these are just traditional calcium carbonates. You can either add them as like a limestone. It's not super soluble, so I don't recommend it. But there are other types of lime out there that are useful for supplementing calcium, including hydrated lime, one of our favorites. We're going to talk about it a lot, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in the magnesium section here. But hydrated lime, at least in the US, contains both calcium and magnesium in a pretty solid ratio most of the time. Now, I will warn you, if you're in Australia, if you're anywhere else in the world, hydrated lime is a little bit different than it is here in the States. Here in the States, it's a mixture of calcium and magnesium hydroxides. So it basically supplements both at the same time. It's very basic. It's relatively soluble and does a great job at supplementing both. Here in the US, we'll actually supplement hydrated lime kind of 50-50 with potassium hydroxide. And between the two of them, they do a great job at supplementing all of those nutrients together. Calcium, though, there are other options, including things like bone meal and oyster shells and other things. Now, these are carbonates, and we try to stay away from carbonates as much as we can. So if you want to raise pH, then I recommend hydrated lime as a calcium supplement. And if you don't want your pH to be raised, then I highly recommend something like chelated calcium. It's a great addition. It's relatively non-toxic, and your plants will love it. Keeps that calcium good and soluble and helps them take it up. So good stuff, and it works quite well. So that's typically how we do it. Now, the last one is magnesium, and magnesium is interesting because in hydroponic systems, magnesium deficiencies tend to be fairly common, mostly because we're mixing like a calcium nitrate with kind of the main part of our mix with magnesium sulfate. Well, in aquaponic systems, we're not mixing magnesium sulfate, and it's not a major component of our main nutrient supply. That's the fish food, right? But magnesium is oftentimes deficient, especially in really high nutrient demand crops. So we have a few options here. Now, if you're supplementing hydrated lime already, then you're already supplementing some magnesium. That's great. And most likely, if you're raising pH really regularly with a mixture of potassium hydroxide and hydrated lime, then you're not going to really see magnesium deficiencies very often, if ever. However, if you have a neutral pH, then you're pretty much limited to magnesium sulfate, which is Epsom salt. Totally natural, harvested in the wild. Harvested in the wild. I hate the term harvested in the wild. It's mined, basically. So, but it is pretty renewable. It's very common, and it's super duper cheap, which is the important thing, right? So it's a great way to supplement nutrients, magnesium specifically. Now, a lot of people will say, "Oh, Nate, you're adding, potassium. So you're advocating potassium sulfate up above. You're advocating magnesium sulfate down here for supplementing these nutrients. Aren't you worried about a sulfate toxicity? So having too much sulfate in your system?" And I say, well, not really. it takes a lot of sulfate to start showing up a toxicity. A lot. You would be surprised. And so the plants can really tolerate a lot of sulfate in solution, and it just so happens that it's removed pretty fast by all of your organisms. So no, I've never seen it before. And I've seen a lot of systems, and I've seen a lot of systems that are really screwed up, let me tell you that. But I've never seen a sulfate toxicity in any system, even in the systems that we've supplemented really, really heavily with magnesium sulfate and potassium sulfate. So that's a good thing to know. You can ease your mind. You don't have to worry about sulfate deficiencies. So magnesium deficiencies typically are sulfate toxicities. Sorry, guys. See, when I start talking for 20 minutes like this, pretty soon I get to the point where I start to either lose my voice or just start to ramble or lose my mind. So if I start to sound really crazy, it's probably because I'm going a little bit crazy talking into this microphone for so long. So, all right, back on track here. Magnesium toxicities, yes. Oh no, sulfate toxicities, not going to see them. Don't got to worry about it. Okay. Magnesium deficiencies, though, the easiest way to describe magnesium deficiencies most commonly for most plants, because remember, from plant to plant, these things change. But for most plants, the easiest way to diagnose magnesium deficiency is a little bit of bronzing. So bronzing is basically where the plant leaves kind of turn a little bronze color, maybe a little slight brownish tinge to them. It's not necrosis per se, but it's kind of just really unhealthy, sickly looking leaf tissue. And mostly in the older growth, you'll see kind of this bronzing start to show up. But get the key, check it out, and really take advantage of a more detailed description there, because from plant to plant, things tend to change, at least in how they kind of show toxicities and deficiencies. So it's worth kind of getting the full gamut of, descriptions of how those things manifest, so that you can really keep an eye on things and you can nail it down real tight and say, this is clearly potassium or clearly magnesium or iron or what have you. So there we go. Bronzing for deficiencies. It is a fairly common deficiency in these systems, and we can supplement it with Epsom salt primarily, and secondarily with like a magnesium hydroxide in the form of hydrated lime. Now you can also do magnesium chloride sprays if you need to, but with all of the chloride sprays, I always say, it's a super fast response, but you really have to know what you're doing. And you got to be really careful, because foliar applications of salts can be really, really, you've got a lot of potential to screw things up, right? But they are really, really effective. So be very careful. Start with a smaller dosage, apply it in the evening sometime, wait a few days to see if you see a response, and reapply and just kind of continue. It doesn't hurt to go through and rinse your plants off between applications on occasion, simply because, salt accumulation on leaves is never a good thing. So all of these things are essential for your system health: potassium, calcium, and magnesium. However, they're kind of the big three because they interact with each other in really weird ways. Not only are all three of them commonly deficient in aquaponic systems, but they impact how the others behave in the system. So without getting into too much detail, I will save that for a USU course, for an Upstart University course. Without getting into too much detail, I'll just leave off by saying that calcium and magnesium interfere with each other if one's in excess. Similarly with potassium and magnesium, these elements are very similar to each other in many ways, in kind of how they behave in the system and how the plant interacts with them. And so some of the sites that the plant uses, these little tunnels that the plant has in its membranes to kind of suck these things out of the solution or to move them from the aquatic solution into the plant itself, sometimes they just get so bogged down in one element that they can't take in the other one, in essence. So the thing to remember is that sometimes these deficiencies, especially if they're not curing, if you're applying, if you're spraying, if you're adding them to the solution and they just won't seem to fix themselves, sometimes it's worth a water test, or it's worth some type of analysis to figure out if maybe the problem is one of the other elements existing in excess in your system. So I know that can be really confusing and kind of scary for folks, because who wants to pay a university to do a water test? But for any grower out there, especially if you're thinking about getting serious, it is worth it to send a water sample off to a university and find out exactly what kind of the chemical composition of your solution is. And that will help you make some great decisions. That being said, I will say that potassium exists in higher concentrations in most indoor systems, so systems under light. than outdoor systems, okay? So if you're growing indoors, whether it's aquaponic or hydroponic, and you are not seeing a potassium deficiency in your plants because you are supplementing potassium in some way, or you're just using a formulated solution, you will typically see potassium accumulation in your plants at higher levels than you would outdoors. I don't know why. I've never been able to really do a study, but I will tell you, I consult with a lot of different people. I look at a lot of different water tests, and I have never seen a single indoor grower, aquaponic or hydroponic, who didn't have high levels of potassium in their plants. That's not necessarily a bad thing. They weren't seeing any deficiencies or toxicities, and it wasn't interfering with uptake of other nutrients. But it's just kind of an interesting side note. It's something that I've learned over the years that I don't really think I've seen documented anywhere else. But I will tell you that if you are growing indoors, don't be dismayed if you get a water test or if you get a tissue analysis back that shows your potassium is maybe 2, 3, 4 times what it probably should be or typically is in field production or outdoor production for that matter. So interesting side note. Actually, I'm not sure it's an interesting side note. You're probably bored to death. Hopefully you're not listening to this while you're driving. Stay safe. Don't listen to Nate Story's podcast while you drive your car. You might crash, fall asleep at the wheel or something like that. Anyways, back on track here. I've got a note here that says it's time for my outro. So wrapping it all up, these elements don't play nicely together, but most of you can avoid any pain by simply raising your pH with a mixture of hydrated lime and potassium hydroxide. If you do that, you're going to be in the clear 95% of the time. And if on top of that, you're adding a little bit of kelp meal concentrate on occasion to kind of just keep your system peppy and happy, you're never going to have any problems, most likely. If you do, let us know. Definitely use the key to find out what those problems are, and we'll definitely help you diagnose them. So, thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Aquaponics Academy. I hope it was interesting to you. I hope you did not fall asleep at the wheel. But, I mean, I enjoy this stuff. I think it's pretty darn fun. So, if you enjoy it too, please do tune in for the next few podcasts. We're going to get into a few more things and jump into some more nitty-gritty kind of details of nutrients and system management and kind of all the fun stuff that we have to deal with as aquaponic growers. So thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate you sitting here and listening to me blather on. Definitely tune in for the next episode, and I'll look forward to chatting about the next subject, which is iron. Oh boy, iron is awesome. So tune in for the next one, and we're going to learn all about iron. Thanks so much for listening.